Regarding the public consultation that's in the communications plan, it says that's happening February 2014. So that's actually before the consent will be decided upon. So how does that work with the...
Well, that's an interim date. That will be, it'll obviously be contingent upon a recommendation being received by Council from HBRIC. So whatever HBRIC requires before it makes a recommendation will determine the timing. Right.
And finally, thank you, regarding the private investors and the press release says they've signalled their attention to potentially invest. That includes Ngāi Tahu. How does that marry up with what Ngāti Kāingauna have said about they didn't feel that Ngāi Tahu were going to be wanting to invest on this patch without their sort of blessing, if you like?
I was at a meeting some 2 months ago here in the council with Andrew, Ngāi Tahu CEO of the investment portfolio, and two of his colleagues, Peter Paku as chairperson of the Niki investment company, and two colleagues. The meeting lasted for about 2.5 hours. It was very... Did I say Mike Paku? Oh, sorry, Mike Paku is the chair. A 2.5 hour meeting. It was very informative, and discussions and explanations went backwards and forth. Later on that evening, Roger, Marker and I had 4 hours with the same Ngāi Tahu group, and Roger extended the invitation to come down to talk to the Tai Whenua. I also understand that Sir Mark Solomon and Mike Sang have met with Ngāhiwi and the Niki board after that meeting. Something that stuck in my mind from that from the meeting a couple of months ago was Ngāi Tahu investors said, "We hope the water's not too cheap," and that sort of sounded like, well, why would you hope that? And they said, well, when they invested in some of the schemes down the South Island, it was so cheap because the waters are flowing at a rate that we don't have here in the summer, that people just poured it on, and as a result, the nutrient runoff was very high. So they said, the dearer the water is, the more it will be sensibly used. So I just thought that was something that sort of stuck in my mind. It was quite ironical. And so this Friday, Niki are coming to Tamatea to have their monthly meeting. So we will be just furthering those discussions about the Ngāi Tahu investment. So I can't comment on something that was behind doors with Niki and Ngāi Tahu, but I'll just say that it was a very cordial meeting we had a couple of months ago.
Right, thank you.
One last thing, was somebody else before me?
Oh, no, you've got the floor. One last thing.
What was it?
Smokos at 3:30.
Mental block. Oh yeah, Opua Dam. Has there been any work done comparing similarities and differences between Ruataniwha and Opua Dam? Because I've heard a lot about how similar Opua Dam is, and Ashburton and how great it is. But I've actually been with council to Opua Dam, and it's a very different terrain and climate, etc., from here. Have there been any? I'd love to see some realistic work at comparing similarities and differences.
Ruataniwha's Opua is the only scheme in New Zealand that includes large-scale storage and distribution. It is Opua's in a catchment which is not on the main divide, the South Island. It's actually towards the east. And so the Opua River generally has the same issue as the Toki. It doesn't carry a lot of water through the summer period, and what Opua's been able to do, the Opua scheme's been able to do is substantially improve irrigation reliability, because formerly they were taking their takes off the surface flows of the Opua River, didn't actually run.
No, I'm just asking though.
But I'm just
not
here.
your opinion.
Sorry. Well, that's not my opinion, and I'm giving you an indication of what the similarities are, and I'll give you an indication of what the differences are.
But that wasn't my question though.
Well, do you want to hear it or not?
Well, I want to know if there's been any independent work done.
Has there been any independent work done?
Oh, not down at the financial level, but in scheme comparisons, absolutely. Yeah.
I think in the environmental area, the council had a key piece of work done on flow optimisation around the flushing flows, and certainly there's been a lot of investigations around how the flow regime operates at Opua, which was sort of fed into that flow optimisation report, which is part of our key reports through their experience there. And Dr. Osei coordinated that work in his flow optimisation study, and certainly about the time he was doing that, there'd been a major report released out of Opua looking at all those environmental performance factors, which was looking pretty positive. So we did use it as a working example of how the flushing flows could work.
Mr. Chairman, just could I comment briefly on the comparison between the two dams? It's very difficult to, because the climatic conditions and the geological conditions are so different. What would be a more relevant comparison is to see how much cynicism and scepticism there was in the formative stages of that, putting that process together. And I think you'll find there's probably a fair bit, and then to compare that scepticism with the end result, where those that opted out wish the hell they hadn't.
Can I ask one different question around the comments that we heard this morning, and put this one to bed too? And this is a comment from the Labour Party, Meka Whātere, that we failed to look at alternatives. There's also a report in this morning's paper that discussed what had been spent today on the feasibility. So perhaps we could outline whether alternatives have been looked at, and the Section 32 analysis that has to be done with a... was on the radio this morning. Meka Whātere.
Let's answer the question. It doesn't really matter who made it.
So,
it's been attributed. So.
I'll give a wee bit of history, and Graham can give a wee bit of the specifics. That's all right. So the history is that going back to the origin, pre-feasibility, we looked at what we call medium-scale storage in the Toki system, in the Rotanipa Basin particularly, which was a direct response to the granting of 5-year consents for current groundwater and surface water takes. Think about Twyford. In that process, in that pre-feasibility process, we had 6 preferred sites identified, and at medium scale, off-river, infill pumping, and so forth. And we had around about 14 in reserve. So we've gone through a major process over a 4-year period to narrow it down to a viable site. So, and in addition to that, so maybe you want to pick it up there, Graham, in terms of your involvement in the project, and particularly deal with that on-farm storage issue too, can you? And I'll give you more context around that in a minute.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I suppose certainly as part of putting my evidence together associated with the EPA process, some of this actually predates me in terms of my predecessor's time from the inception of this project. But certainly in the very early pre-feasibility phase, there was a desktop exercise, but certainly on a strong experiential base or advice from our consultants Tonkin and Taylor looking at on-farm storage, initially as a range of options and concepts that we were looking at in terms of either on-farm, small-scale or large-scale, and there's often confusion between small-scale and specific on-farm storage. So at that early stage there was just on certainly an experiential and a typical cubic metre per cost of construction basis and analysis done. It was certainly left on the table as an option, but certainly as a significant fallback option if the particularly I suppose initially the small-scale storage, there was fatal flaws in that process, and in fact as we transpired through the process, and it was economies of scale that drove us into large-scale storage that basically led us away from that process. And of course the real issue to remind ourselves of was it was also about irrigation and storage, but it was also about environmental issues associated with the project. And certainly that's What's been offered with the large-scale storage is the environmental consideration, and we certainly wouldn't see that or realise that out of a whole range of small-scale storages. The other issue also, particularly on a basis of a scheme of this size, around 25,000 hectares, 90 million cubes, you're looking at about between 3,000 and 3,500 hectares of productive land that would go under small-scale storage, and anything from sort of 2.5 to 4 metres deep. So yes, there are alternatives. We've looked at them, and by way of comparisons, there were costs around $6 a cube for a small-scale dam of less than 5 million cubic metres. 10 million cubic metres, it was in the order of $4 to $5, and once we pushed up into the 50 million cubes plus, we were down into the $1.50 range. So it was quite a dramatic change, and that was the process we went through, and hence the advanced pre-feasibility phase that was added to the process, acknowledging that size and scale was something we needed to make this thing viable.
Great. Heath.
Yeah, I will add something in the RMA context. So I was intrigued to read that claim this morning that we hadn't looked at alternatives. Actually, under the RMA, there's a requirement where there's any potential adverse effects to look at alternatives. And there's a whole section in the AE that we presented to the EPA on that alternatives program. So saying that there hasn't been any, just I was a bit dumbfounded about, because we've specifically fulfilled the requirements of the RMA, and we've devoted a whole section of the AE to that particular question.
Yeah, perhaps just to add to that also, as the other documents are also publicly available. Tonkin Taylor Technical Feasibility Report, the feasibility report from the project team to council, addressed the same issue. So these have been in the public environment since most of them of October of last year. So again, explained in various forums through reports of the project.
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, are you talking about alternative dam sites, or are you talking about complete alternatives to water storage, other ideas altogether? What are you referring to?
There's in the AE we looked at on-farm storage, so small farm dams, and a different range of ways of delivering irrigation. The other thing I'll say is that through some submissions, some parties have raised the prospect of actually, how do I say it, charging up the aquifer at the top for recharge, and then letting the aquifer fill up and then take it from there. And the evidence from our experts says that that's not likely to be successful. So that's been assessed through our evidence. So pretty comprehensive look at all those alternatives through both the AE and the evidence in chief we've lodged with the EPA.
Heath, can you just give us a brief outline of the HBRIC component of this paper, and then we'll take a few more questions and we'll move on. Or are you just happy to... Well, pretty much, yeah. The financial stuff, if there's any questions around that.
I think the report itself, the report itself sets out the commentary on the financials on Table 1. Firstly, we've got the operating income and expenditure statement, which is sort of the P&L for HBRIC, which just covers off the expenditure for the month. Secondly, we've got the capital expenditure on the RWS for the month of August, and looking at project actual costs right through the Phase 2 in the EPA process, which totals us at $5.5 million. So I think the report itself has got the key details around the commentary, so happy to take any questions on any of that.
Mr. Chairman, am I able to ask the question that couldn't be answered before? Even it's not on the exact paper we're talking about, but it's on the report. It's about the consolidated accounts with the short-term funding, the short-term debt, which is now sitting in the group's accounts. Now, it's not obviously the regional council, it presumably sits with the port. A lot of it's at 6 months, and I just wanted to get a sense of what's happening there and what's the risks. It's maybe an unfair question. I'm happy to take the answer later if you need to think about it.
Yeah. I've talked to Mr. Collins about this. I've contacted Napier Port CFO. This is the information that's provided from their audited reporting pack. It is Napier Port's numbers. He needed to go back and have a chat with the auditors exactly about the breakdown of that, so I was still waiting for a call from him, so unfortunately I can't answer that at this point.
So long as he's not printing it out the back, I'm okay.
Any other questions about any of the above? Councillor Ramswell.
Just about the social aspect, and at the Andy McFarlane briefing, which sadly wasn't open to the public. I thought that was a shame that it was just a select group. But I was talking to the head of WINS there, and his comment to me was that the jobs would be very unlikely to be for any of his clients. And further on from that, a lot of the seasonal work, like with the the fruit growers work, they actually import workers from overseas for the season, and then they go back to Vanuatu or something. And also with a lot of dairy farms, they also bring in workers from overseas, such as Philippines and so on. So it's hard to know how there's going to be a benefit for workers in Hawke's Bay with those things. Have you got any comments about that, please?